This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can find all the cards in this video in their store by using the links in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitzahone, and it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Today we're going to look at cards with a 5-color identity. In Magic, a card's color identity is determined by the number of colored mana symbols that appear in its casting cost or in the text box. A card with a 5-color identity has each of Magic's mana symbols appear on it somewhere. So this means that a card like Conflux has a 5-color identity because of its casting cost, and Composite Golem has a 5-color identity as a result of its text box. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have a 5-colored identity. In all, there are 98 cards with a 5-color identity in Magic, and in this video we'll take a look at the cards that have left the biggest impact on competitive Magic. This isn't the first time I've looked at cards with 5-color identities. I did it the first time, way back in 2020, and as you can imagine, the list has changed a ton in the last 4 years. Before we get started, here's a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A first tier top 8 is worth 2 points, this includes events like Pro Tours, and a second tier top 8 is worth 1 point. This includes events like regional championships. Before we take a look at the top 10, let's revisit the 6 cards from the 2020 list that didn't make it this time, starting with Obelisk of Aara, which came in at number 10 last time. For 6 generic mana, this artifact comes with 5 activated abilities, one for each of Magic's 5 colors. Each of them cost 1 generic and 1 colored mana, and you tap it. The white one gains you 5 life, the blue one lets you draw a card and then discard, the black one gives a creature -2/-2, the red one does 3 to a player, and the green one gives a creature +4/+4. This is a nice little Swiss Army knife. The black effect is straight up removal and is often the best of the bunch, but all of these other abilities have their places too. No matter the situation, the Obelisk probably has an ability that can help you. The Obelisk's 1 point came in a 5-color control deck in the standard of 2009, where it could serve as one of the deck's win conditions. It hasn't gained any points since then, and while just 1 point was enough to make the list 4 years ago, a card needed 9 points to make it this time, so it's never going to get back on the list. Next, there's Horde of Notions, which was at number 9 last time. While it has the same single point the Obelisk has, its 1 top 8 was a higher finish, so it got a higher slot. It costs 1 mana of each color, it's a 5/5, and it has Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. You can also pay 1 mana of each color to cast an elemental from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. Obviously, if you're playing an elemental deck and your mana is good, Horde of Notions is pretty scary since it adds a frightening presence to the board and basically guarantees that you're going to find a way to add more elementals to the board on your next turn. Its only point came in Lorwyn block constructed in an Elementals deck. It did see a bit of a resurgence in Modern in 2021 when Elemental decks became a force in that format, but Elemental decks using the Horde never top-8'd any significant events, and these days it's not seeing play at all. Next, I've got 2 cards because I had them share the number 8 slot last time, for obvious reasons. Both of them are 5-color slivers, Sliver Queen and Sliver Legion. Sliver Queen has more points, so let's talk about her first. For 1 mana of each color, she's a 7/7, and you can pay 2 generic mana to make a 1/1 Sliver token. She also happens to be the first 5-color creature ever printed. Her 1 first-tier top 8 came in 1999 in a 5-color Survival of the Fittest toolbox deck in Extended, and the Queen was something you could grab when the game went long, since she could come down and add a bunch of extra bodies to the board. Meanwhile, Sliver Legion costs 1 of each color for a 7/7 that gives all slivers +1/+1 for each other sliver in play. The Queen doesn't really need other slivers around to do her thing, but Sliver Legion does. Its 1 point came in a Sliver combo deck in Time Spiral block constructed. If you're interested in a deep dive on Sliver decks, including that one, I have covered Sliver decks in my deck history series. Both the Queen and the Legion have been inactive for a very long time, and they're never going to be on this list again. Next, there's Channel the Suns, which was at number 7 last time. For 3 generic and a green, this sorcery adds 1 mana of each color to your mana pool. Green doesn't usually get ritual effects, but that's what this is. It gives you a very real mana boost, and can even help you cast 5-color cards. As with many rituals, it's good in Storm decks. All of Channel the Sun's points came in extended Storm decks back in 2008. These decks play a bunch of ritual effects, including Channel the Suns, and would then fire off a Tendrils of Agony with a huge Storm count and win the game. However, it isn't a good enough ritual effect to see play in Storm decks and other formats. Lastly, there's Genju of the Realm, which was at number 5 last time. For 1 of each colored mana, this is a legendary enchantment and an aura with Enchant Land. You can pay 2 generic to animate that land into an 8/12 Trampler until end of turn. And when the enchanted land is put into your graveyard, you can return the Genju to your hand. So this makes any land into a pretty serious threat, and the Genju is going to keep coming back, unless your opponent destroys it specifically. Its points came in 2005 in standard enduring ideal decks, which look to ramp into the powerful epic spell, then search up some prison enchantments to lock the opponent out of the game before grabbing a win condition like the Genju. Genju of the Realm doesn't have any points since 2005 though. Alright, with all of those out of the way, let's take a look at the list proper, starting with our number 10 card, which is the Kami War, which is a newcomer to the list that didn't exist back in 2020. Genju of the Realm might not be here anymore, but at least a different 5-color card from a Kamigawa set made it. This saga costs 1 generic and 1 of each color. As a saga, it gets a lore counter when it enters the battlefield, and then it gets another one after your draw step each turn, and anytime it gets a lore counter, you get the chapter effect equal to the number of those lore counters. So the turn you cast it, you get chapter 1, which lets you exile a non-land permanent opponent controls. Then on your next draw step, you get to bounce a non-land permanent to its owner's hand, and then each opponent discards a card, and then on the draw step after that, you exile the Kami War and it returns to the battlefield as the enchantment creature Okagachi Made Manifest, which is a 6/6 with flying and trample, and when it attacks, the defending player chooses a non-land card in your graveyard, you put that card into your hand, and Okagachi gets +X+0, where X is the mana value of the card. If you have to pay 5 different colors of mana, you're expecting something really powerful, and the Kami War doesn't disappoint there. It immediately removes something, then disrupts your opponent with the second chapter, and then becomes a must-kill creature that can end the game quickly while getting you back cards from your graveyard. It's been played as a win condition in Standard's 5-color control decks, and it also sees a bit of play in Pioneer Fires of Invention decks, which don't really need to worry about actually producing 5 different colors of mana to play it. It doesn't have any points so far in 2024, and it might be done gaining points, so it might not be on the list if I revisit it in 4 years. At number 9, it's Mizit Supreme, another newcomer that wasn't around back in 2020. He costs 1 of each color, and he's a 5/5 with flying and hexproof from monocolored. He also gives Jumpstart to instants and sorceries that are exactly 2 colors in your graveyard. This means you can cast them by paying their mana cost and discarding a card from your hand. This Niv is a huge flyer that is immune to a ton of removal spells, and if you've got the right spells in your graveyard, he's also a pretty amazing value engine. It's gained all of its points in Pioneer Bring to Light decks. It lets you tutor up creatures, instants, or sorceries with mana value equal to the number of colors of mana you spent on it, and grabbing Niv with it is pretty nasty, because on the next turn, you can just cast it again, thanks to Jumpstart. Mizit Supreme looks well positioned to keep gaining points in Pioneer. At number 8, it's Invasion of Aara, our 3rd consecutive newcomer, and spoiler alert, this isn't the last newcomer we're going to see here at the bottom of the list. For 1 mana of each color, it's a 7 defense battle, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile cards from your library until you hit 2 non-land cards with a mana value of 4 or less. Then you cast one of those for free and put the other into your hand. The invasion lets you cast its other side once it's out of defense counters, and you can get rid of them by damaging it with attacks or spells. Once Invasion of Aara is out of defense, you get Awaken the Maelstrom, a sorcery which does a whole bunch of stuff, and it should, since casting Invasion of Aara isn't easy to do, and 7 defense is a ton. The Maelstrom draws you 2 cards, and you put an artifact from your hand on the battlefield, then you get a token copy of a permanent you control, and you get 3 +1/+1 counters, distributed however you want, and then you destroy an opposing permanent. All of this invasion's points have come in standard 5-color control decks, which are fully capable of casting the invasion and enjoying all of the insane value it can give you. The deck can also use the invasion as part of a combo. The only card in the deck that the invasion side can actually hit is Bramble Familiar, and hitting it with the invasion lets you cast the adventure side of the familiar, at which point you can potentially reanimate something like Itali. It's likely to gain more points in standard in the future. At number 7, it's Couriers Briefcase. As promised, this is yet another newcomer to the list. For 1 generic and a green, it's an artifact with the treasure type, which means you can sacrifice it to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. When it enters the battlefield, you get a 1/1 creature token, and you can pay 1 mana of each color to sacrifice it and draw 3 cards. What you get up front from the briefcase is kind of decent already, as it gives you back a mana by virtue of being a treasure, and gives you a 1/1, so the fact you can cash it in for 3 cards later in the game is great. As you'd expect, it's been played in Standard's 5-color control decks, but it's also played in Pioneer Transmogrify decks. These decks specialize in making creature tokens, and then transmogrifying them. The only actual creature card in the deck are multiple copies of Atraxa, so you can give up your 1/1 citizen to get one of the most powerful creatures in the game. The deck also isn't incapable of sacrificing the briefcase, as it has great mana. The briefcase is going to keep gaining points in both Standard and Pioneer. At number 6, it's Layline of the Guild Pact, which is the last newcomer on the list, and also the newest card on it, having just been released in Murders at Karlov Manor. Despite only coming out this year, the Layline has quickly amassed a ton of points, mostly in Modern. For 1 green-white hybrid mana, 1 green-blue hybrid mana, 1 black-green hybrid mana, and 1 red-green hybrid mana, Layline of the Guild Pact makes it so all of your non-land permanents are all colors, and all lands you control are every basic land type in addition to their other types. And like all Laylines, you can put it onto the battlefield as the game begins if it's in your opening hand. The decks it appears in look to really abuse the fact you get it into play for free. In Modern, there was already a 5-color domain deck doing well in the format, so the introduction of the Layline meant that those decks could really maximize their domain payoffs. The Layline enables the deck's most powerful play, a 2-mana Scion of Draco that has Vigilance, Hexproof, Lifelink, First Strike, and Trample, and he grants those keywords to your whole board, too. Right now, this is one of the top decks in Modern. While it does also see some play in Legacy, it isn't really a major player in that format right now. It's likely to keep gaining points in Modern in the future, and it's likely to move up this list too. At number 5, it's Progenitus, which was at number 2 last time. For 2 mana of each color, Progenitus is a 10/10 with protection from everything. And if it would be put into a graveyard from anywhere, you reveal it and shuffle it into its owner's library. For a while, Progenitus was the scariest creature in the game, and it was what you wanted to cheat into play. After all, it can't be killed by any targeted removal, it can't be blocked by anything, and it can't be damaged by anything, and it can even end the game in 2 swings. This led to people wanting to put it into play with Hypergenesis in Extended, Show and Tell in Legacy, and Oath of Druids in Vintage. In addition to that sort of thing, it was also used in Infect decks in both Modern and Legacy that looked to use Blazing Shoal to buff an Infect creature like Glistener Elf and win the game in 1 swing. Progenitus gave you a red 10-mana card to make that happen. Progenitus' best days are behind it though. Now, that isn't to say Progenitus doesn't see play anywhere. After all, it has gained 16 points in the last 4 years, and is being played right now in decks like Legacy Elves and Cradle Control, which can cheat it into play with Natural Order. But it's far from the premier creature you want to cheat into play in any format. I mean, why would you want Progenitus when you can have a Traxa? Still, Progenitus is going to continue to gain points, but not really enough to move up this list, and Layline of the Guild Pact is going to pass it very soon. At number 4, it's Mizit Reborn, the original 5-color Mizit, who came in at number 6 last time. For 1 of each color, he's a 6/6 flyer with a great Enter the Battlefield ability. You get to reveal the top 10 cards of your library, and then for each color pair, you can choose a card that's exactly those colors from among them and put them into your hand, and you put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. In the decks Niv is played in, most of your cards happen to be exactly 2 colors, so you play this huge flyer and draw like 4 cards, at which point the game is usually over. He didn't make much noise in Standard because mana wasn't good enough and the card pool wasn't large enough to build a functional deck where he could draw you tons of powerful cards, but Mizit Reborn decks have been a fixture in Pioneer ever since he got printed, and an eponymous deck also appears occasionally in Modern. All of that has led to him gaining 48 points in the last 4 years, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. At number 3, it's Golos Tireless Pilgrim, which has moved up 1 spot from last time. For 5 generic, he's a legendary 3/5 artifact creature, and when he enters the battlefield, he can tutor up any land and put it into play tapped. He also has an activated ability for 2 generic and 1 of each color, and it exiles the top 3 cards of your library, and you can play those cards without paying their mana costs. Yeah, Golos is a super powerful card. His ability to tutor up any kind of land, including non-basics, is great, and his activated ability is the kind of thing that can win the game in a single activation. In Standard, he was played alongside a whole lot of non-basic lands, the most notable of which was Field of the Dead. The Field is an incredibly powerful land that cranks out 2/2s for free, and Golos made it very easy to make that happen. This ultimately resulted in Field of the Dead getting banned in Standard, and Golos didn't see much play there after that. That interaction also got Field of the Dead banned in Pioneer and Modern. However, it has a life in Modern beyond Field of the Dead getting banned, as it sees play in decks dependent on other powerful non-basic lands, like the Tron lands or Valakut. Similarly, it's played in Legacy Cloudpost decks and Vintage Mishra's Workshop decks. Golos is going to keep putting up points in Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and he's likely to eventually grab the number 2 spot on the list, but for now, that card is Kenrith the Returned King, which was at number 1 last time, so he's been dethroned. For 4 generic and a white, he's a 5/5, and he comes with 5 activated abilities, 1 for each color. For 1 red, he can give all your creatures haste and trample. This means if you have red lying around after you play him, he can give himself the buff right away. For 1 and a green, he puts a +1/+1 counter on a creature. For 2 generic and a white, he can gain you 5 life. For 3 generic and a blue, target player draws a card. And for 4 generic and a black, he can reanimate a creature card from a graveyard under its owner's control. He's kind of like Obelisk of Aara, which we saw earlier, except he also adds a beefy body to the board, and he can use his abilities more than once a turn. That's a pretty big upgrade in most ways, and that's why it's found way more success at Magic's highest level of competition. Kenrith has kind of a funny competitive history because he saw play in deck after deck that ended up getting banned. First, he was in the Golos Field of the Dead decks we just talked about. Then it was played in Fires of Invention decks, which would have no use for their mana once Fires was in play, unless they ran a creature with powerful activated abilities, and obviously Kenrith fits the bill there. Fires eventually got banned in Standard, so then Kenrith transitioned into Wilderness Reclamation decks, which could double their mana with the powerful enchantment, and Kenrith was a good place to spend it. So of course Reclamation got banned too. Then it was played in Omnath ramp decks, which had plenty of extra mana lying around to use those abilities, but then Omnath got banned. He finished out his time in Standard by appearing in Winota decks, which could cheat him into play with Winota's Trigger, and while Winota did get banned in other formats, she never got banned in Standard, but then he rotated out. That said, he did see play in Pioneer Winota, and she ended up getting banned in that format. Other than that, most of its time in Pioneer has been spent in that format's version of Fires of Invention. He's still gaining points in the format, but it's highly unlikely Kenrith will ever reclaim his throne on this list over the number 1 creature, which has a fairly commanding lead that it's only going to build on. And that card is Gante, the Wellspring, which was at number 3 last time. Gante costs 4 generic and a red-green hybrid mana, and you get a legendary 5/5 that can tap for 1 mana of each color, although that mana can't be spent on generic mana costs. That's not really a card that would normally see competitive play, but Gante is also a companion. This means that if you meet a deck building requirement, he's effectively an 8th card in your opening hand. His requirement is that there is no card in your starting deck that has more than one of the same mana symbol in its mana cost. Under the original companion rules, you could cast him directly from your sideboard. This ended up being way too busted though, and they issued a rule change for the entire mechanic. Now you have to pay 3 generic to put a companion from your sideboard into your hand first. This slows things down significantly and opens you up to being disrupted by discard effects. Gante is interesting because he's inherently less powerful than pretty much all the other companions. I mean, he looks really sad next to Yorion and Lurrus. In a lot of games, he's just a vanilla 5-mana 5/5. So why has he been played in every format? Well, because his companion requirement is the easiest of them all. For every other companion, you have to go out of your way a little bit to make use of them. That's not true for Gante, as there are many decks that just happen to meet this requirement, and if you do that in any format where Gante is legal, there's no reason not to use him as your companion. He definitely gives you an advantage, as if you flood out or something, you're likely to be able to grab him and cast him. Gante is going to keep racking up tons of points, especially in Pioneer and Modern, and for now at least, it's hard to imagine any other 5-color card ever passing it. So those are the top cards in Magic with a 5-color identity. If you want to own any of these colorful cards, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. If you want to catch up on the more than 700 other MTG top 10s, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. And if you want to go the extra mile in supporting me and the channel, you can do that by becoming a channel member or a patron. You can find ways to do those things in the description. Thanks for watching.